Calico, a musicologist at Vanderbilt University and a member of this year's program committee. And it's a pleasure to have you with us for the first time this morning, or again, if you were here yesterday, today starting with our second keynote address. I'll just point out that we don't have Slack channels for the keynote addresses. So if you have questions, please post them in the chat, and Richard and I will keep track of those and collect them for discussion at the end of Estelle's talk. Our special guest this morning, it's a great pleasure to be able to introduce Dr. Estelle Joubert, who is Associate Professor of Musicology at the Fountain School of Performing Arts, Dalhousie University in Canada. Her research interests include opera and political theory, music in the global early modern period, and computational approaches to musicology. From 2015 to 2019, she was principal investigator for a large-scale research project called Opera and the Musical Canon, 1750 to 1815, funded by the prestigious Shirk Insight Grant in Canada. Current projects include a monograph entitled German Opera and the Politics of Sensation, 1750 to 1815, the 17th and 18th century volume of A Cultural History of Music, co-edited with David R.M. Irving, and a graph database visualization software project to analyze operatic fame in the 18th century. Her talk today is entitled Traversing 18th Century Networks of Operatic Fame. So please join me in virtually welcoming Estelle Joubert. Need audio? So Estelle, we can't hear you?
Yes.
There you go. Okay.
I'm good?
Yes, you're good.
Yes. Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be speaking today. And I will share my screen so that you can see some slides. Right, so the talk is entitled Traversing 18th Century Networks of Operatic Fame. And there we go. And I begin with a quote from the late 18th century. "The public is the toughest and finest critic in the world, and yet a clumsy folk tune is enough to amuse it for an entire year," writes J.F. Schulze with some exasperation in the Deutsches Magazin in 1798. The late 18th century witnessed a remarkable capacity for the public rather than rulers to act as critic and supporter of the performing arts. This new context also witnessed the rise of the classics and the much debated musical canon, which was taking shape at the same time as Schulze's comments. One might come away thinking that fame is fickle, subjective, and fleeting, thereby defying systematic analysis. And yet the broader processes of collective ascriptions of value and the emergence of the musical canon suggest that there may yet be some structure inherent in these complex cultural processes. The question that lies at the heart of my current project is, how did music become famous at the time of the emergence of the classics? Did musical works acquire fame in view of criticism or performance? Are there broader patterns of attaining fame, particular to specific art forms, or in the case of music, genres? The problem of canon formation and the classic, I believe, is really a network problem. We're dealing with a dynamic network of people and things, and for the purposes of my project, people and things related to 18th century opera. Librettists write operatic texts, sometimes in response to commissions or royal events. Composers compose music. Singers perform and sometimes adapt arias. Publishers print full operatic scores and collections of famous arias. Manuscript copies of operas in full or part move via agents such as diplomats, travelers, or other composers. Critics review opera performances and opera prints available to them often via libraries or lending libraries. Some opera critics even comment on other critics' assessments, forming long and complex interrelated chains of aesthetic assessments leading to canon formation. In effect, all of these actors together contribute to processes of operatic fame. And to be more precise, as physicist Albert Laszlo Barabasi puts it, and I quote, "Networks are only the skeleton of complexity, the highways for various processes that make our world hum. To describe society, we must dress the links of the social network with actual dynamical interactions between people," end quote. My efforts to dress the links of 18th century musical network find their home in a large-scale project called Visualizing Operatic Fame. A project of this scope requires various kinds of expertise, and I gratefully acknowledge the contributions of my various team members. Visualizing Operatic Fame asks the question, what factors contributed to operas being established as musical works during the late 18th century? Answering this question necessitates bringing together evidence from a wide range of sources: reviews, scores, performance calendars, catalogs, and so forth. For computational purposes, this means a variety of data types. Each source type contains various kinds of data. For example, performance events, found primarily in theater calendars, includes the name of the opera, composer, date performed, names of performers, or at least the troupe, and the performance space, usually the name of a theater. Since my project involves a range of data, it features distributed data governed by relationships. This emphasis on relationships also determines the type of database. Most databases are relational databases, meaning that data is stored in highly structured tables. These tables can be linked using IDs. By contrast, graph databases, the most famous example being Facebook, emphasizes relationships between the nodes and are much easier to query. I decided to use a graph database as the types of queries available to me in a relational database simply didn't answer my questions. For example, early on in the project, I endeavored to find out which operas were the most famous in a given time frame. My results were typically a list of operas, which I could visualize in a bar chart. And this is my early findings of opera in the Sing Academy archive in Berlin. Among the limitations of relational databases is that all entries are treated equally. If one were to survey opera reviews, for example, there is no way to distinguish between an opera review that is a paragraph in length versus one that is many pages in length. Each result in a relational database is weighted the same, and relationships are difficult to foreground or query. Visualizing Operatic Fame is a graph database powered by Neo4j, the leading commercial graph database platform, and uses Cypher as query language. More recently, we have turned to using Neo4j Bloom as our visualization tool, as it is now free for desktop use. The tool is designed to represent relationships not only between individuals, composers, opera singers, and music publishers, for instance, but also objects related to operatic fame: scores, reviews, images of actors. The data model has been tweaked a number of times so as to sharpen queries and visualizations. Currently, we have, for instance, people such as critic, composer, and objects such as journal as nodes, and incidentally, the designations are known as labels for each node. Edges, these are the arrows that connect the nodes, are directional in Neo4j, and multiple connections between two nodes are possible. One of the central questions and theories of the musical canon is whether works become famous in view of multiple performances, or whether canon is really a function of music criticism. To get to the bottom of this debate, my data model has an ideal opera node, which allows me to distinguish between opera performances, its own node, and opera reviews, which are over there. Put another way, I am able to distinguish between a review of a performance and the review of an operatic work, more generally. We have endeavored to be quite precise about relationships, as it is also possible to search by relationship type. For example, in our data model, a composer composed operas, whereas a librettist wrote a libretto and a critic critiqued an opera. This allows searches that distinguish between the librettist's and the composer's relationship to an opera, potentially routing a query through a different path in the network. Although this representation of data of our data model does not show them, each of the nodes also have distinct properties which facilitate querying. And moving now to the Neo4j Bloom interface, this is just a screenshot. My opera performance node, for example, has 10 properties. They're listed here, some of which, meaning city, coordinates, and performance date, will allow us to map the results later on. This also shows the data type for each property, strings, of course, being the most common. So data types are there. My talk will use examples from this database, but it will focus more broadly on 3 common types of queries that one might encounter in graph theory: searching and pathfinding, influencers and hubs, and clusters and communities. Turning now to the first of those sections, searching and pathfinding. Given that my database contains over 37,000 nodes, it is obviously unworkable to call them all up at the same time. Instead, it is more productive to choose an entry point into a graph and expand relationships as desired. I'll begin with Maria Antonia Walpurgis, Saxon electress and composer. She is important in the history of the musical canon, as her operas were the first musical works to receive reviews that included in-text music examples during the 1750s, in turn enabling detailed commentary on the score itself. Switching to Neo4j Bloom, the first step is to search for the composer node, Maria Antonia, and you'll notice that there's also a person and librettist and original review node. So we'll go to the composer node. Double-clicking on the node allows one to see the various kinds of relationships. And I'm going to expand in the first instance her 2 operas, Il Trionfo della Fedeltà and Talestri. So we now have the Maria Antonia composer node along with 2 of her operas, and these are ideal operas. And I'm going to expand the Talestri node once more. Right, so the full score node can be expanded yet again. This is our last expansion. And we'll let the gravity do its thing. So that reveals a review of that particular score, in this case by the critic Johann Friedrich Agricola. And if I want information on the node, I can see it there. So a number of strengths of the graph database come to the fore here. First, reviews are not merely ascribed to a composer or even a work. Instead, criticism can be directly ascribed to a specific performance of a work, the printing of a libretto, or the printing of a particular score. These results seem to reinforce the material dimensions of opera criticism. Unlike later Kantian ideals associated with aesthetic autonomy and canon formation, visualizing how operatic criticism was generated uncovers just how directly reviews, and consequently also aesthetic judgments, were formed in response to the material conditions of operatic performance. One curious finding is that amongst the performances and prints that received criticism, the 1772 Collected Works edition received no critical attention. That's the node right there. Visualizing these connections thus offers a much more nuanced picture of which objects related to Maria Antonia's operas actually affected fame and which ones did not. In a sense, it prevents assumptions about what we often presume must have generated fame and what demonstrably or empirically did. And these are just some slides in case the live demo didn't work. In addition to exploring the network starting with a particular node, it is also possible to search for pathways between the two nodes. One of the most popular pathway searches in graph theory is the so-called shortest path search. This is particularly useful when trying to ascertain whether two people or a place and a person, for instance, are connected. For example, for the question, are there any direct connections between Gluck and Johann Adam Hiller? The result is fairly simple, and this is the Neo4j, the normal coding interface, which it's actually just easier to query with that interface rather than working through Bloom, I find. So the answer is yes. There is at least one connection. This is the shortest path, and there may be other longer paths. As it turns out, Gluck and Hiller were both reviewed by Daniel Gottlob Turk. Now for a more complex example. Did Mozart have connections to Berlin? We know that he traveled there once in 1789, but we're now interested in how prominent Mozart's music was there and how Berliners came to know the composer's music. There are indeed many paths between Mozart and Berlin. The Mozart composer node on the left-hand side, that's that one there, is connected to two of his operas, Don Giovanni and Così fan tutte. Most of the connections in Berlin are reviews connected to 5 journals: the Berlinisches Archiv, the Journal der Moden, Magazin der Musik, the Musikalisches Wochenblatt, and the Berlinische Musikalische Zeitung. And these are the yellow nodes. The red node without a label here is the city of Berlin, and we also have connections to some of Berlin's musical institutions, most notably the Royal Prussian Court Chapel, the Royal Opera, and the Dublin Theatre Group. These are also red nodes. Judging by the short titles of some of the reviews, über Konzerte in Berlin, so concerning concerts in Berlin, or öffentliche Musik in Berlin, public music in Berlin, one might surmise that some of these critics are describing 18th century concerts, which often contain separate arias from operas, among other musical numbers. While some reviews offer direct coverage of an opera performance of Don Giovanni and Così fan tutte, it seems much more likely that Berliners might have gained familiarity with Mozart's music through excerpts in public concert life and via reviews of his music. And this, of course, happens alongside publications of the score, and my database does not yet list the vast quantities of sheet music circulating during this period. The search for pathways between Mozart and Berlin not only yielded a fairly complex portion of the network, it also hints at our next topic in graph theory: influencers and hubs. In his groundbreaking work on network science, Albert Laszlo Barabasi examines the underlying structures of complex networks in a wide range of disciplines, including the movement of fish in oceans, the spread of disease, transportation, as well as various social networks. Almost all networks, he argues, include an uneven distribution of nodes, the clustering of nodes, and ultimately the formation of hubs. Music networks are no exception, for, as we are well aware, some composers received many more performances and much more critical attention than others. A search for hubs, these are nodes of particular importance in the current dataset, reveals the following. And this is a bird's eye view of a query for composer hubs, and the top 7 influential nodes, and these are the little nodes in the center, include the following: Johann Adam Hiller, Johann Gottlieb Naumann, Christoph Willibald Gluck, Johann Friedrich Hönicke, Antonio Bianchi, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and Friedrich Ludwig Brandes. So these are the orange nodes in the center. Neo4j has grouped these in clusters surrounded by nodes representing their popular works. These are the pink nodes, and reviews that generated fame in the public mind, and these are the nodes in green. It is also possible to get a view of these hubs in the network, and this reveals much more context surrounding these influencers. Focusing on Gluck, for example, he's the orange node right there. We notice that his composer node is close to that of one of his librettists, Calzabigi. The works that are most prominent, these are the pink nodes, are L'Arc Enchanté, Iphigénie en Aulide, Alceste, and Armide. Orfeo, a work often taught in music history surveys, seems to have far fewer connections. It would seem that Alceste has many more connections to music criticism. Notably, the German version of Alceste, likely performed in Vienna in the early 19th century, did not feature prominently in criticism. What is missing here, and indeed is a next step for this project, is the dimension of time. For fame can indeed be fleeting, and queries such as this one show only a representation of the entire period, 1750 to 1815. If one were to query by decade, or indeed create a dynamic time-lapse representation, one would likely see that Gluck's fame was established with a discourse surrounding Alceste, that his fame remained relatively stable, and that toward the end of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, that is, after the composer's death, his fame was sustained by performances rather than continued criticism. Performances of works such as L'Arc Enchanté, Iphigénie en Aulide, and Armide were staples in early 19th century Vienna, when there was a craze for French opera, often performed in German, following the arrival of Napoleon's troops in the city in 1806. Scrolling a bit to the right, one also gets a sense of how Gluck is connected to the broader network of 18th century opera. He is connected to Lully. Might have to go, no, I'm gonna stay here. He is connected to Lully through a review entitled Gluck und Lully. But he's also connected to Handel and Rameau through criticism. Moving now to the lower left-hand corner, we see the prominent hub of a lesser-known composer and musician, Antonio Bianchi. And here, the obvious question is, do hubs of canonic composers look different in structure compared to those who are lesser known? And for scholars interested in machine learning and AI, the obvious next step is, can one predict fame, especially for musicians today? And I'll note that Neo4j does offer some predictive algorithms in their graph data science playground, though these are still relatively new and still experimental. At first glance, Bianchi seems to have composed a similar number of operas compared to Gluck, and most of his operas are connected to a review, an ideal opera, and a librettist. Yet somehow the Bianchi hub simply looks much cleaner than the Gluck hub. I have a shot of these side by side. We have Bianchi up top, and this is Gluck. There are fewer pathways traversed through the node, and the concept seems less messy, if you will. While it is far too soon to connect messy network structures to lasting fame, clearly much more work remains to be done on this. This idea of patterns of fame surrounding hubs holds much promise. And I move now to the final section called clusters and communities. Hubs bring prominent nodes, either individuals or works, to the foreground, while community detection and graph theory is concerned with similar things naturally grouping together. In a social network, some nodes naturally have more connections than others, and musical communities form around performance events, genres, debates in music criticism, societies in particular cities, and star singers, to name only a few. It is fair to assume that communities play a substantial role in generating musical fame, and by extension, canon formation. Much more challenging, however, is to uncover these communities in a given network and analyze patterns within those communities. Let's begin with a relatively simple example, a search for troops connected to performances of Mozart's Die Zauberflöte, the magic flute. The query returns a range of clusters of performances, each stemming from a theater troupe or resident theater company. The largest cluster is, of course, the Theater auf der Wieden in Vienna, where Mozart's famous opera was premiered. But, as is evident, the opera was also performed at the Kärntner Theater in Vienna, the National Theater in Berlin, and the Prague National Theater, and these are the three second largest clusters. Subsequently, we have even smaller centers such as Mannheim and Innsbruck, as well as traveling troupes such as the Schuch and Volotini companies. Queries such as this one tell us about the relative size of performance clusters for a famed opera, which is useful for a broader bird's eye view perspective, perhaps prior to zeroing in on a particular group. Yet along with communities comes the challenge that social networks do not only have bi-directional edges, but in some cases, especially in global music mobility, there are asymmetrical power relationships at play. Here I turn to an example from the work of one of my students, Sister Laria Colshaw, and her paper for my research seminar on operatic mobilities. Colshaw graphed using Graph9, its custom graph visualization software. She graphed the French Siamese musical encounters between Louis XIV and the Franc Narai in the late 17th century. Her work was based on primary source documents analyzed in a study by my colleague David Irving in his article Louis in Siam, which is present-day Thailand. Figure 2 in her essay represents the two communities, each with their respective monarch at the center. So we have Louis XIV and the Franc Narai. That all the arrows point back to each of the monarchs arguably illustrates an important point about these societies. Power is concentrated at the center and often in a single person in monarchical societies. In this particular diplomatic visit, cultural exchange could not only be facilitated by people and things, could only be facilitated, by people and things represented by a few common nodes. And we have these 4 common nodes in the middle here. These are some ambassadors from both parties and a letter of 1673. With so few commonalities, it is perhaps unsurprising that this cross-cultural encounter went awry, like so many others in the early modern period. This example illustrates 2 notable features of graph theory: that 2 communities can exist entirely on their own at great geographic distance, and that it only takes a few, sometimes even only one connecting node, to suddenly collapse the distance between 2 faraway communities. Of course, important nodes that connect two otherwise separate communities appear, disappear, and reappear over time. Second, at least on French soil, there was an asymmetrical power relationship at play. More sophisticated graphing tools and algorithms able to cope with weighted nodes would bring these relationships into relief. While monarchical societies have a particular structure, so do democratic societies, and my database reflects society at a time in which liberal democratic ideals were just beginning to take hold. Public perceptions of fame reigned supreme by the 18th century, as Schulze, the critic commenting on the year-long popularity of a clumsy folk tune suggests. Even within the public sphere, musical communities might differ in their structure, makeup, and impact on generating musical renown. One of the advantages of graph theory is that it has the potential to both detect community formation with appropriate algorithms and also detect patterns distinct to individual groups. The Neo4j data science playground is a relatively new plugin intended to facilitate the exploration of data sets with complex algorithms. The idea behind the playground is one does not need to deal directly with the code, but can still benefit from the power of often called algorithms through an easier to use interface. However, the tool is still experimental. I was able to get some preliminary results for community detection. And this is our final slide. The largest center, a community, seems to be centered, unsurprisingly, around a genre node, the German opera genre node. And a subset of that community, these are the orange node, is centered on an opera that opened the Theater auf der Wieden just 2 years before Mozart's Die Zauberflöte was premiered there. And that opera is called Die beiden Antons by Benedikt Schacht. In fact, this suggests that the community for Die beiden Antons is likely stronger or perhaps larger compared to that of Mozart's opera. Future research for this project will be focused on pattern detection to see how various communities, once identified, are structured and how that structure has an impact on canon formation. Some interesting questions might include, did communities for symphonic music look different than communities concerned with opera? Do the sub-communities have similar structural patterns, or do some of them differ, and why? Does the behavior of musical communities change over time? While graph theory has already provided valuable insights into how operatic fame is generated in my dataset, many more insights remain to be discovered traversing these networks of operatic fame. Thank you.
Estelle, if you want to stop sharing your screen, and that way we can get some Q&A, maybe more people in the view. Thank you. That was so exciting. I learned so much, and I have so many questions, but I don't want to dominate the Q&A period. So we'll open this up. As I said at the beginning, Rich and I will be monitoring the chat function. If people have questions they'd like to ask, please post them there, and we'll keep an eye on those. Oh, it looks like Alexei has jumped right into the fray. He says, I like your entries collection about Mozart, and he sends greetings from Digital Interactive Mozart Edition.
Oh.
He said, is there any API to MEI? Any API to MEI process?
Yeah. From the database, I don't actually know. Yeah, I'm not sure. So I'm the one who did some of the. My team did some of the data entry. Some of the data is taken from printed sort of lists and things. And then there's some data that was bits and pieces taken from a few other databases. So it's a collective sort of collection of data. And I'm not sure if Neo4j would would have that. I mean, the API is mine, so obviously I can do with it as I want, but I wonder if it would depend on the back end. And I'm not sure if that answers that question.
I don't know. Maybe he'll follow up if not.
I'm looking for a follow-up in the chat.
In the meantime, there's also a question from Johannes. Who entered the data and how do you assess coverage of sources, compositions, reviews, etc.? So you did mention that your team, it's a collaborative effort to enter data, but how do you assess the coverage of those sources?
Well, as is the issue with data, is you can somehow always find more sources to enter, right? So we started with, I mean, it's not worth repeating work that's already been done. So we started with reviews that had already been cataloged.
Mm-hmm.
And books like Dorothea Link's book on the court theater in Vienna has lists as well. So we filled out individual theater repertories for performances. And then we're adding catalogs sort of as people's articles and books demand. So my postdoc has a book connected to the project. We've obviously both had some articles connected to the project. So we seem to be now having a big bird's eye view picture, adding things as we need them to get more nuance, if that makes any sense. So I suppose my database might be slightly unusual in that the database is not the end product for us, but instead our publications are still the end product. But there's certainly been a lot of data entry done by a lot of students on various sources. Yeah.
It looks like Richard himself has a question. Do you think that the performing arts engender kinds of networks that are in some way different from those involving exclusively material forms of expression?
Well, I think if you were to compare music to literature, music, I think, is much more complex because of the performative dimension, right? Literature, you would have, and I think there's a reason that English scholars have done a lot of work in DH, because they have novels or poetry, plays sometimes to work with. But all of their works are also fairly easily available for download from places like the Gutenberg Project. Whereas as soon as you're dealing with music, you're dealing with the score, at least you're dealing with performances, you're dealing with criticism, you're dealing with catalogs. It just feels much more complex. So because there are many more actors involved in the network of production and consumption of music, I think they do look different. So yes, I think that is the answer. I think it's just both the complexity of the genre and the number of actors involved that it makes it look and feel very different.
That would be my sense. A project I did that did not involve this level of database or graphic representation about the circulation of Schoenberg's A Survivor from Warsaw and post-war Europe. And what I kept coming up against was the fact that actually the presence of performers was a lot more important than the presence of Schoenberg at any given situation, and trying to account for that. So my personal experience would suggest that that's really a critical consideration.
Yeah.
Julia was asking, could you briefly describe the data entry creation process? What kinds of information is actually captured?
So we had whole sessions with my team that were broadly under the umbrella of from document to data, because of course it's relatively easy to take a list of performances in a theater with a given year and put them in, create nodes out of those. But as soon as you're dealing with criticism, you've got RAs reading a review or a description of a performance in a different source, and they then have to make decisions about what they want to capture and what we're going to leave out, and it has to be consistent, right? So what we did is we learned as we went along, to be honest.
Yeah, right.
We used an Airtable data, and from the get-go decided that we're going to tell stories. This is something that's done in the software world as well. So you don't start with how much data you have. You start with what do you actually want to get out of this database?
Mm-hmm.
So for my projects, my articles, I had certain stories of do the communities for symphonic music differ from opera, and how? Or can I query for performance reviews versus reviews of musical scores? So with those stories, we then decided that we're going to enter, and I think actually comparatively little data. So for reviews, it's not that much, right? It's the sort of the title, the name of the journal, the critic, enough information that you could find it again if you click through the node. But we did not make any effort to enter as much as possible. So in that sense, it's not exhaustive. It's very much tailored to the research questions that we had. And then using, in some cases, it's easier to use for an RA to have a spreadsheet that you then upload. And in other cases, people work directly with the Graph9. We had a Graph9 interface, which is the custom software that we had. And you could do data entry directly through that, and it writes it back to the Neo4j database. So things have morphed over time, I suppose.
Yeah, right. I think that happens a lot. Is it? And I'm sorry if you said this and I missed it. Are you capturing keywords? You know, are there adjectives or things that are circling through different types of reviews? Or, I mean, maybe that's not of interest to your project.
I don't think we have keywords, actually, partially because the nodes, I think, are so specific. If we're already distinguishing between an ideal opera and an opera performance and an opera score and a libretto, then and you can search by all the labels, which are the names of the nodes, then I don't think you need keywords. It's just a different form of data entry. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah.
Laurent, I think that's also gets at your question, but ping me if that's not true. Emily Ann Hopkins is asking, do you think factors like wealth, cultural background, class, etc., map onto numbers of connections, or could they be represented in some way, either implicitly or explicitly?
I think, of course, wealth and cultural background and class would map onto numbers and connections. And my opening example of Maria Antonia, she's royalty, right? So of course that is why she has that many reviews, and she was able to print her beautiful opera scores for the Bright Cup firm, and so on and so forth. So certainly that maps on. I think it might be interesting to use eventually weighted nodes so that you can distinguish between social, I guess it would be nodes with more connections, or certain kinds of connections would appear larger. Mm. So that would account visually for some of that. But I think we also can't underestimate all the sheet music, and that points to sort of more bourgeois, if you will. I'm hesitant to say middle class because it's caught up with a lot of issues, but that is one big thing that is not present here, right? And it's there's all this ephemera around famous arias and so on. And I suspect if we were to start entering sheet music, the clustering might shift quite substantially again. Yeah.
Let's see. Miriam has a question about the proofreading process with such large amounts of data. How are you keeping? What's the workflow process, I guess, for things being approved? What your research assistants are doing?
Well, I suppose we're doing this in a very time-consuming fashion. Of my postdoc supervised a lot of the master's level and undergraduate level RA, so he would literally go through and make sure that everything is accurate. And I spent about a week cleaning up data before we uploaded it, and we still find idiosyncrasies. Yeah.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so let's see. It looks like Johannes has got a question, might be useful at this point. Have you considered mapping your properties to other data models, such as Wikidata or RDF ontologies? I personally would be really curious about Wikidata.
I haven't actually thought of that, to be honest. I suppose we've been so caught up trying to figure out all the cipher and algorithms in Neo4j. So the answer is no, we haven't considered it, but it would be quite interesting to do that. Yeah, that's a great suggestion.
I was co-teaching a course a couple of years ago where one of the projects was to use Wikidata because it's so easily accessible, all these kinds of, but it also skews very German and very North American. So, you get these blips from other places. It was really, it revealed all sorts of fascinating things that were not the point of the project, but it was, we just thought it would be so much more helpful to have more input, more data points to work with in that way.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Let's see, Nevin, could you also comment on the possibility of utilizing your method to map the networks and other musical environments where notation is not common?
Musical environments where notation is not common. Yeah, I think it would work fairly well because you just don't have the nodes that that revolve around scores, right? The question is, what would you, so you would have to come up in your data model with some way of representing sound in that musical environment, and then think about how that connects to the various actors. Yeah, I think that would be fairly straightforward in my mind.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see, Julia Flanders, adding to your first point, suggests the difference between literary study and this kind of work results more from deliberate research choices by literary scholars who focus on the text itself rather than on cultural interconnections. But approaches focusing on reception definitely take into account a range of data, similar complexity as this. So in that case, you're talking about the reviews, positive, negative, mixed. I guess that's partly getting at or what I was trying to think about in terms of keyword. You they get a lot of publicity, but is it skewing one way or another?
Yeah. My next step, if I had to put together a new grant proposal, would be to look into sentiment analysis and natural language processing, because I think if we were able to crack that nut and we were somehow able to analyze sentiment in each of these reviews in some way, shape, or form connected to musical sound, I think it could be really interesting. So that the positive, negative, mixed is exactly what I've been thinking along those lines, and it would also be great to have the process be somewhat automated, and that of course is the holy grail, right? So that we don't have humans reading reviews and making decisions about them, but can we somehow speed up that process a little bit? But yeah, I'm looking into sentiment analysis sort of on the side at the moment to see what potential that holds.
Fantastic. I see Jim De La Hunt has also indicated that Music Brains is another interesting database to which you might link. Wikidata and Music Brains also.
Okay, thank you.
David talking about on mapping to RDF. This would be very valuable as it would allow other graphs, say on concert ephemera, to connect to and benefit from your data set.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I suppose, and I'm realizing this more and more to state the obvious, is that the best and more nuanced scholarly results right now come from putting data sets together, right? So certainly I need to be looking into these kinds of collaborations a little bit more. Yeah. I suppose I've been holding back a little bit because I'm working with our librarians on intellectual property for some of the bits that we did take from other places. So that is what's been holding it back, to be honest.
Yeah.
So we're allowed to publish articles and books right now based on the data using these examples, but it's unclear to what extent we can post a lot of this online. And certainly the stuff that we've done, we can go ahead and do, but there are still some IP issues to just double check. Yeah.
thinking about sentiment, so you would also need that in multiple languages and declensions,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
it's a
It's a
that's
difficult thing. Yeah, no, I've looked into some tools, and indeed you would have to learn to do it not only in that language, but also in 18th or 19th century French and 18th and 19th century German, right? So it
yes,
would, and there are certain idiosyncrasies to language in that period as well that you would have to factor in.
yeah,
So it becomes very complicated very, very quickly, but it's still, I think, worth pursuing. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Richard is saying that the Doremus from the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris is another public ontology for art music. Might be worth considering.
Right.
I love what you say about the messy network structure, maybe because it just feels like a good metaphor for the state of my life right now in the COVID-19 era. But that seems so promising to me. What you can get out of the messy network compared to the
Yeah.
cleaner network.
Yeah.
I actually think that's a conceptual idea you could really work with, because
Yeah.
the visualization is so stark that you can see, people's lives are messy. Why wouldn't their reception history be messy? And
Yeah. Yeah.
like when we talk about entangled history as a conceptual framework for history, that this looks a little bit similar to me in that regard. Like
Yeah.
there are
Yeah.
yeah, that slide was, I thought, yes, that seems like there's really some traction to be gotten out of that. It's a great
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, and looks like Stefan has another question, or another point. He's talking about the MusicCon Performance Network platform. Oh, I don't know this.
Oh,
Okay, so
from
this
the
is at the
SLUB.
SLUB in Dresden.
Oh, yeah.
Ah,
Yeah.
good to
Yeah.
know.
It's a great library. Um, thank. This chat will be available afterwards, right? I'm madly writing these things down, but
I believe that since it's
is it?
being
Is it?
recorded, there's a
It is
transcript
being
option
recorded. So
too.
okay,
So
perfect. Okay, yeah, just in case.
that's my
Yeah,
understanding of it.
yeah.
I suppose the last question that's raised for me, and this is, um, if there's any reason that, or any way in which, did you think about actor network theory about Bruno Latour when you were doing this? He
Yes.
seems like the inevitable
Yep.
figure in networks.
Oh
So,
yes.
okay,
Yep. Yep.
could you just
Yeah.
talk through some
So
of why that wasn't? I'm not a stand for Bruno Latour. I'm just saying, was there a reason you didn't go with that?
it actually lurks in the background, right?
Okay.
Because the whole issue with actor network theory, or at least a discussion in musicology, is whether objects have agency, right? And of course Latour would, and people like Ben Picoud and Nick Matthew would say, yes, of course they have agency.
Yeah.
Ruskin would disagree.
Yes.
I also think that they have agency, which was why I boldly had things as nodes.
Yes.
Right. So
right.
my taking that step, actor network theory, was actually pretty liberating in that sense. That so that's why we have so many nodes that are things, and they're as important as people. So it does, that is the conceptual framework that I suppose lurks behind
okay.
that model. Yeah.
Yeah. I find that really useful. I love the thing node, because it's, even if you can't account for exactly how its agency, it's clearly significant.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
So oh yeah, so the transcript of the chat is saved with the recording as a separate file. So
Perfect.
you'll absolutely be able to retrieve all of that.
Okay.
Do we have any other questions for Estelle? This was fascinating, and I feel like this is such a great complement to the talk we had yesterday, Timothy's talk about pedagogy and bringing these tools into the classroom. And then you gave the fantastic example from one of your students about how that process worked. I think it's really inspirational to think about this. So thank you so much, Estelle.
Thanks very much for having me.
Really fantastic event.